Edit.
Hello everyone, this is Eric Lindsay again. In our last video, we talked about pitch and how we label pitch on a piano. Now, let's translate some of these pitches into musical notation using a musical staff. A 5-line staff in music is a place where we notate pitches on the lines and the spaces using open or closed note heads. And a note head is a kind of circular oval dude that can be closed if it's filled in all the way, or open if it is more like a circle. This is the default way that we notate pitches in traditional Western notation, which isn't to say there aren't other awesome approaches. As note heads go higher on the staff, pitches rise. We can go by step, or we can skip over a line or two, or we can go down like this. Now we can extend the staff beyond 5 lines using additional ledger lines. Let's write that down. Ledger lines, which are basically extensions of the staff, where we can continue, I'll switch it over here, to go down by creating lines and spaces beneath the staff or above the staff. Here's a high note there. We're starting to get above. We're just alternating between drawing lines and drawing spaces. Those were our high notes. Now, you might recall that the 88-key piano is what we consider the full range of musical pitch, and this staff only has 5 lines and 4 spaces on it. This means that we only have 9 notes that can fit on the staff, and we have to use these ledger lines for the rest of it. That'd be crazy. Luckily, no. We actually have a number of ways to avoid the use of ledger lines because we find ledger lines kind of hard to read. It's much easier to kind of read things that are in the staff. So the first way that we do this is through the use of clefs. A clef. And a clef is basically a glyph that we put at the start of a staff system to select part of this piano range, and this is going to indicate that we're in a certain range of the piano. So we have a range of clefs. This is one of them. This is a treble clef. This is a bass clef. This is a alto clef. This is a tenor clef. We have all these different ways of notating these pitches. Some of them are going to be more prevalent than others. The two that you'll find the most use is going to be our treble and our bass clef. Treble clef is often the default choice of clef if the majority of your pitches in your composition are above middle C. Remember that here's octave 1, 2, 3, and here's middle C at C4. So we're going to basically think about the treble clef as signifying the best way to notate everything above middle C. Treble clef looks like this. We have a line that extends a little past the top of the staff. We're then going to curve it around by the second line within the staff, come down and curve it back, and come to rest on this lower line. And a lot of times you'll see a kind of lip there at the bottom. In one fell swoop, it's more like that. Now, it's interesting where that line, that little curve, comes to rest. It comes to rest on this line. In this line here, when we have treble clef, that is a G. Sometimes treble clef is called a G clef because the second line of the staff where the curve ends is indicating that this is G4. G4, as we can recall, here's C4, D4, E4, F4, and G4. That is that note right there. I'll move my little clef right there. So this line right there is G4. And we can basically count through the alphabet to figure out who else are the lines and spaces on this clef. So if we went down, F4, that is E4, above which is A4, B4, C5, D, and E. Now, if we wanted to continue to the top of that 5th octave, we could start using ledger lines above the top line and just alternate between lines and spaces. So we said that is D, that is E, F, G, first ledger line A, above which is B, and then over here at the top is C6. And because I would like us to get all of this whole octave here, let's go ahead and walk that E down to middle C. Notice that middle C is the first ledger line beneath the staff in treble clef. Now, as long as you can remember where one of these pitches fall on the treble clef, perhaps it is that the clef rests here on the second line, so you know that that is G, or you remember that middle C is the line beneath the staff, and that is C, you can count lines and spaces, as we've done here, to figure out the rest of these notes. But then, you might find yourself trying to read a piece of music and it looks something like this, and there's jumps, and it's kind of like, it'll take you a long time to count every single one of these lines and spaces. There are faster ways to learn what these notes are without having to count and alternate through each letter of the alphabet. And that is just coming up with a mnemonic device for notes that are on the spaces and notes that are on the lines. So the treble clef has two popular mnemonic devices. One is for the spaces, one's for the lines. For the spaces, many people think of the treble clef's spaces as servant face. The spaces as servant faces. So that's an F, that is an A, that is a C, and that is an E that is on the spaces of the treble clef. And remember that we're talking about treble clef only. These lines are not the names of every line of a staff. Every time we're looking at a staff, because we might have a different clef at the beginning of it. And when this clef changes, these notes align differently on the piano and on the staff. So remember, this is just the mnemonic devices for the treble clef. So for the lines, as you might know, one note below F is an E, meaning this is going to be an E, G, B, D, and F. And come up with whatever you want this to be. Some people like to think of every good boy does fine. Otherwise, the patriarchy. So let's see if we can notate that short composition that we wrote in the first video on the treble clef using the skills that we just learned. Remember that the tune went like this. Let me clear out some space for us. C, D, E, C, A, G, C. So let's go ahead and translate it. Let's go ahead, first of all, start off with the treble clef. We start on C4. You remember that C, this is G, F, E, D, C. C4 is the first letter line. And so it was C, D, E, C. So C, D, E, C. Then it leaped. Whenever we don't go to the next note of the piano, we say that's a leap. We go down to that A. So we don't have B. We need to go down instead. One more letter line to A. That is A3. We go down to the G beneath, use that space. And then we leapt back up to C. So congratulations, folks. We just wrote down our first tune on the staff. Now, let's say we wanted to make this tune cooler, and instead of ending on that C that we started on, let's play it a C an octave above. So it'll be C, D, E, C, A, G, and then this C, C5. Let's go ahead and erase this note. Remember where C is, and we can use our face technique because it's on a space. So it is C5 is that space right there. So the last note we could say went there instead. Let's get familiar also with this higher range of the piano. Let's get a little bit more up here. So we're going to transpose. So transpose. Or move our melody. So instead of having it start on middle C, how about we take it up 2 octaves? Not that 5, but to C6 is where we're going to start it. So let's go ahead and remember that we were at C5 here, and the very top note of our spaces is an E. Let's just walk it on up. E, F, G, A, B, C is our C5. So our tune is thus going to take place up here. C, D, E, C, A, G, and then, oh my goodness, we're supposed to leap a whole octave above that first C. And so if I started to count out lines, we're going to be in the stratosphere, homies. Here's a C, then that's an E, and there's a G, there's a B, and our C is way up there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 letter lines? No way, homie. No one's going to be able to read this all that easily. Bum, bum, bum. So another way of accessing that higher octave without needing to use all these letter lines is using the ottava symbol. Ottava is otherwise shortened to 8VA. And sometimes there's a little bracket there. So 8VA just means play this note an octave up. And this is a great way when you're playing very high notes just to be able to say, well, I'm pretty good at finding that C, and I just want it to be an octave up. So I'm just going to write 8VA for that very last note. So then it would sound like this. Now, we've talked pretty thoroughly now about music that's at middle C and above. What about the music that's beneath? So to explore this range, we're going to use another clef. We're going to use the bass clef. Let me go ahead and erase. I mean, it was rad, but let's erase all this. The bass clef looks something like this. It starts on that second line, and then it has two little dots around that second line as well. And bass clef is also known as an F clef. And so you might presume, who is this line? This is an F, in fact. So if you wanted just to figure it out, if we know that that is F, and the F we're talking about is actually the F below middle C. So if this is middle C here, that's C4. This is F3, F3, G3, and A3. And if we went down, E3, D3, C3, the bottom of that octave, B2, A2, G2. And who are we talking about? That is the corresponding note. So we can use mnemonic devices to memorize notes in bass clef as well. As we can see from our labels, the spaces are A, C, E, G. I'll say it again. The spaces are now pertaining only to bass clef. Don't confuse which mnemonic device you're using for each clef. So we could call this, what? All cows eat grass, which is true. And the lines, this is, who's beneath A? It's G, G, B, D, F, and A. And what could we have? We could vary our one from above. So good boys do fine always, which is also mostly true. Or you can vary it a little bit. You can say Green Bay doesn't F around. Whatever works. Okay, so whatever's going to work for you from now is the way to roll. So now we've been talking about a single staff with a single clef at a time. And this is fine. A lot of instruments that we know are going to be within one range, reading from one staff at a time. But we often will come across instruments with a very wide range that are expected to play notes in different ranges simultaneously. Like this piano. If we're playing on this piano, we might be tasked to play something down here and up here at the same time. What are we supposed to do if we can only do one clef at a time? Well, that is when we will stack two clefs and make what's called a grand staff. It's the Voltron of clefs and staves. So a grand staff is usually going to have a treble clef on top and a bass clef at the bottom and a bracket on the side. And this is called a grand staff. And you'll see this a lot in piano music, harpsichord music, harp music, anything that can basically go through an entire range of musical sound by themselves. So you might have noticed something earlier that was interesting about where C4 was located. It's not in either of these staves. It requires a ledger line above the bass clef and a ledger line beneath the treble clef. Looking at the grand staff, we can see that in fact this ledger line is the same one, situated in the middle of the grand staff, which is another reason why we call C4 middle C. The first time we notated our melody earlier, you might remember that we needed a second ledger line for A3 and G3. Well, that's in fact the top lines of the bass clef. So the very first time we notated this, back in the original octave, that was our tune. And we notated it like that. This ledger line we've already identified as being the middle C line. But that line down, that A, boys do fine always, that is this A here. This G is that G. So one way we could have notated that, if we're going to use the grand staff instead, is something like that. Is a way of representing these things across those two staves. So we also have an ottava basso symbol. So ottava basso, which will appear beneath the bass clef only, and that is 8VB. And similar to 8VA, this means that we can get all the way down to this C, and this is in fact, if we decided that this was C4, this is C3, this is C2. And as we already talked about, C4, C3, C2. What if I wanted to play C1, bad boys? That's going to involve another big old set of ledger lines. We could just take C2 and write 8VB beneath it. and that would actually trigger us to play C1. So now that we have a way to notate any pitch and map it to any note across the range of the piano, we are one step closer to one of the goals of the series, which is to teach you how to read printed music and be able to play at least some of it on a piano. Now, as a final point, we only use 8VB for pitches beneath the bass clef, just as we only use 8VA for those above the treble clef. So what do we do for instruments like the cello, or the bassoon, or the trombone, who read from a single staff but have a range that includes quite a few notes above the bass clef? Their range is kind of low C, so C2 for trombone and cello, and they can go all the way up above middle C, all the way up here to C5 pretty much. Or the viola, as we mentioned earlier, octave above that, C3 is their lowest note, and they can kind of go an octave above which. So if we were saying that this is the gate, pretty much, boop, 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 the C4 is basically when we switch to treble up here and bass down here, they're going to have a lot of back and forth between these two, which is going to be kind of rough because something is going to involve a lot of letter lines. So in these cases, what do we do if, say, we have a melody that starts on, what do we say, E3, let's say E3, and it's going to end on B4. So just a good kind of equal distance between those two spots. What do we do clef-wise to make this work out for us without us using a bunch of letter lines? So you're likely to see is perhaps, if you started in bass clef, a switch of clef mid-piece. So perhaps if the tune went like this, let's say here is our E, and then it went to C, and then our B, if this is C, E, G, B. Let's say it is leapt like that. It's a crazy old melody. If we did a C clef, right? So tenor clef is an example of a C clef where middle C moves to this line there. Sometimes tenor clef is going to have a representation that is more curly, like that. Trying to draw that with a stylus. Same thing. The main thing is that it features a focus on one particular line, and this is middle C. So if we switched it, notice that that middle note is middle C, so we can go ahead and commit to it there. That E beneath middle C is going to be, if this is C, that's A, that's F, that's D, that's E. And this B that's up here is going to be C, E, G, B. So then we're just going like that. So much more kind of centered in the middle of the staff and not the highest. And just reading two letter lines is not the worst thing that ever happened, right? The viola is another instrument whose range includes an octave below and 2 octaves above middle C. So given that there's so much crossing back and forth over middle C and viola music, it's going to read from a C clef variant called an alto clef, which looks the same, but now middle C is this middle line. So if we notated that same thing over, it would just look basically where there's middle C, we would have one less letter line on top. We just add a letter line there on the bottom. And these are all but 4 of a handful of clefs that we use in traditional notation. We mentioned this is tenor clef. This is alto clef. And earlier we said treble and bass. These are just 4 of a handful of clefs that we use in traditional musical notation. But the ones you're by far most likely to come across more often, for most of our purposes in this class at least, are in fact our good friends the treble and the bass. And we'll most often see them as arranged in a grand staff formation. And this allows us to play notes in octaves 2 and 3 around the same time as those in 4 and 5 and above. So let's see if you can apply what we've learned thus far. I want you to get out a piece of staff paper and create a grand staff. If you don't have any staff paper, just draw 2 5-line staves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like that. And then you could just draw clefs like that and bracket them together. I'm going to play 4 notes on the piano, and I want you to pause the video, write them down on your grand staff, and then unpause the video to check your answers. So I'll notate them here on this piano at the top. All right, the notes are. So hopefully you worked this out on your own before pressing play again. Let's go ahead and review what are the notes that I just played. Okay, the first note I played was F3, which as recall is the same F the bass clef is positioned on, so I'll put my first note head here. Next I played E4, which I'll write in the treble clef. If you remember that the treble clef is centered in G4, we can just walk it down to E. Or if you remember that E is the first letter of our mnemonic device to memorize the lines in the treble clef, every good boy does fine. E is the first line, so I'll make my note head here. The second note was down at G in the second octave, or G2. So knowing that F3 is the one on this line, we can walk it down to G, or we can remember that G is the first letter in our device to remember the lines in the bass clef. Green Bay doesn't. So here's where we put that note head. And then finally, the last note way up here, this is D in the sixth octave, or D6. So if we can remember that C6 was 2 letter lines, I'll just go up by 1. And if you didn't remember that, we can just skip a few lines on the top of the staff. Every good boy does fine, that's F5, and then just walk it up the D6. Alternatively, we can take that D that we know in the staff every good boy does, which is D5, and then write 8VA over it. If I'd played a D7 instead, if I'd taken that all the way up here, and we already used the 8VA symbol, we could use a new symbol I didn't talk about, which is it's kind of fun to say, the quindicesima, which is the Italian name for 15th, or 2 octaves above. So if you struggle in this activity, write out all your mnemonic devices on a grand staff, including which octave each line and space is situated on for each clef, and see if you can draw a few note heads on the staff at random, using your annotations as a scaffold. And over time, you'll develop more points of reference to the point where you can immediately recognize any pitch that you see written on the grand staff and point to the corresponding key on a piano. Next, we've said a bunch about where the pitches fall, but little about when or for how long to play them. So to do this, you need to hop over to our next video on tempo, rhythm, and meter. I look forward to seeing you there.